Greetings and salutations. This is Frederick John here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Phoenix framework, a blazing fast web framework for Elixir applications. We're going to get an application started and choose a CSS framework and look at how Phoenix applications are set up so that you can begin to create your own. Let's get started. One thing before we start, Phoenix has phenomenal documentation. I'll post a link in the description. It's certainly something you're going to want to check out if you're serious about learning the framework. We'll use the CLI to generate a new application and create the folder structure and files we need to get started. Elixir and Phoenix use mix as a build tool. So we'll run the generating command mix phoenix.new and then the name of our application, which we'll call Snappy. It asks us if we want to fetch and install the dependencies, to which we'll reply Y. Notice Phoenix is running the command mix deps.get when we responded yes to installing the dependencies. This will be the command that you run when you want to install new dependencies to your application. If you're interested in learning more about the folder structure and files that were created, in the command line you could see a line for each folder and file that was created. You can see our application folder Snappy, a lib folder, as well as a config folder, a test folder, and all of our assets are handled through Brunch. If you haven't tried Brunch before, I recommend checking it out. It's a small build tool that's very lightweight and easy to configure. On their website, they'll show you an example of a typical Gulp configuration file. It's hard to see, so I'll bring it up in another page. This is the JS fiddle of the same Gulp file. As you can see, it's what you'd expect from a web developer. They have Sass, Babel for ES6 and ES7 features. They're uglifying or minifying the files and concatenating them together. The file's about 116 lines. The equivalent Brunch file is only about 16 lines. As you can see, they offer a much easier and much simpler configuration, and it's easy to get up and going right away. You don't have to use Brunch with your Phoenix application. Feel free to use Gulp or Webpack. In this video, we're going to be working with Brunch, since that's the default build tool that Phoenix comes with. Going back to the command line, we'll see that Phoenix has finished setting up our application. We now have a folder named Snappy in our directory. It gives us a message that we can configure our database in the config folder under a file dev.exs and then run mix ecto create to create our database. We can then start our app with mix phx, you'll notice I say phoenix.server. Let's open up the folder now and see what kind of jumpstart Phoenix has given us to developing this Elixir web application. You can see there's been several files and directories set up. We're going to be using Visual Studio Code. The first folder is underscore build. Generally with Elixir and Phoenix, anything that has an underscore you can ignore. The build folder is where the compiled files are going to go when we build our project. You can ignore that for now. Next we have the assets folder, which you'll see has all of our project's assets in it. The CSS, JavaScript, the node modules, all of our dependencies for JavaScript and everything will live in this folder. The package.json file is here, as well as the Brunch configuration file. We're going to look at this folder more later. We have a configuration folder with a main configuration file, as well as configuration files for each environment, dev, production, and test. Ignore the dependencies folder for now. Let's move on to lib. The lib folder is where all of our code is going to go. We have a folder with our application name. We also have a folder with our application name underscore web. This is where our Phoenix project will live inside this web directory. So again, all of our code is essentially going to live inside the lib folder. The priv folder we're going to skip for now. It has the built static assets as well as information about repo, which is the repository We'll use this when we worry about connecting our database. And finally, we have a test folder, which is going to have all of our generated tests as well as our test helpers. Lastly, we have the mix.exs file. This is going to define our application, set up the configuration for OTP, define our dependencies for the application, and some aliases at the bottom here. You can see that Phoenix is actually a dependency for our application, similar to how Rails is a Ruby gem and web framework. Phoenix is a Elixir dependency and the web portion of the application. So we just created a new Phoenix application. Let's start out by running some tests. So you'll notice that we have 4 tests with 0 failures. To run the test for the first time, the application has to be compiled and generated, so it might take some time. But after that, when you run your test, it'll be very fast. We can launch a server with the mix command phoenix.server. Now, notice how I ran phoenix.server and it's given an error message, failed to connect, Postgres error, database snappy dev does not exist. So what we have here is I cannot begin to run the server without having the database be created first. If you remember, after we ran the generation command in the beginning, it said to configure and set up the database. Since the database hasn't been set up, it's not going to allow me to launch the application. I'll simply run mix ecto create to set up the database, followed by mix phoenix server, which will allow me to run the server and generate the example application. Now, once that's running, I can click on the URL, and as you can see here, we have an example Phoenix application that's been generated. So we've started a Phoenix server, and here is the example application that's generated using the Phoenix generator. And what we want to know is, where does this content come from? So in our source, remember that Phoenix is the web interface for an Elixir application. So that content will be located under Snappy Web. Remember, that's the application name _web found in the lib directory, and it's a template, a page template called index HTML EEX. The EEX is the templating language that's embedded in Elixir. It allows us to write Elixir code as well as HTML in a single page. And if you see here, we have a div at the top with the class Jumbotron. Phoenix by default will come with Bootstrap version 3. And you can see here's the unordered list of resources and the unordered list of help, and that's coming right here. Help and resources with our Jumbotron. And here's something that's interesting, a get text module, welcome to name, and where the name is Phoenix. Now, get text module provides internationalization as well as pluralization. You could see the get text module is located here under snappy web gettext.ex, and this file does give some examples of how you can use it for translation or plural translation with the n-getText. So we can go over an example of that quickly. Let's use the getText. We're gonna put n-getText, and then instead of this, what we'll do is we'll do pluralization. So a single post. The syntax is as follows. It's n-getText. The text you want to use for a singular resource, the text you want to use for a plural resource, you have posts and another comma, and then finally the number of the resource. So if we hard code in for now the number 1 and we go back to our application, you'll see it says you have a single post. And notice we didn't have to restart the server or do anything for it to update. It updates automatically. It automatically reloads the code, detects changes, and updates right on the page. So this is hard coded in now, but later we could use a database, or we could pull the number dynamically. So let's say the user has 14 posts. If we save that, it'll say you have, and then if we were using this in production, we would interpolate this X with the number of posts that the user would have. But as you can see, it's very simple to use that module, the getText module. And if we just take it off and save it, it disappears from the page. So this is what you get when you start a Phoenix application. We're not going to be using any of this, so we're going to be able to delete it out. There is one other thing. The Phoenix Framework logo, as well as the Get Started, is not located in this index page. So where is that coming from? Well, that's under the layout, app HTML. This is the main app page. So this is the single page that will get loaded up. You can see it has the doc type here, as well as the HTML head and body tags. Here is the container with the header that has the logo and the Get Started. So we can delete that out, because we're not going to be using that. And as you can see, it then deletes that header portion. It has already preloaded for us some Flash content with info and error. And here is the main tag with a call to a render view module. So this is where the pages are going to be rendered, the templates are going to be rendered inside this main tag here. Essentially, what we'd like to do is we'd like to put our nav bar on the top. That's going to persist across all the different pages, and then we'll have our template. Our templates go here where the main tag is, and then finally along the bottom we can put a footer which will persist across all of the pages. So having a setup like this, each page will have a nav bar, each page will have a footer, each page will have the flash for error and info, and then our individual templates, we can code out and render them all right within this main portion here. So ideally, this is how we'd like to set up our application. We'll start with consideration to the styling. If we go to Assets, CSS, we'll notice that there's two files, an app CSS and a Phoenix CSS. The app CSS is the main application file, where Phoenix is the file that contains some default CSS for the starter, as well as the Bootstrap version 3.3.5. So because we don't want to use Bootstrap or the default starter application, what we could do is delete the entire file. And you can see our application page has changed. I don't really like to use CSS in development. I like to use Sass. It's easy to switch over to Sass from the default CSS in Phoenix. All we have to do is change the directory into assets, and we can then install npm packages like we would any other Node application. We could use npm install, or I for short. We'll save it to our dependency list, and we're going to do Sass brunch. Okay, let's check out our package.json. We can see that our dependencies now include Sass brunch, but we're not done yet. We still have some configuration that we have to do to make sure that everything's going to work properly. Specifically, we're going to add a plugin for Sass, which is very easy to do. You see here we have the plugins, Babel. What we're going to do is add a Sass plugin, and we'll use the options for include paths, but right now we can leave it blank since we're not including any other paths. The next thing we'll do is change the name of the folder since we're not going to be developing with CSS, we're going to be developing with SCSS. And then instead of app CSS, we'll use app SCSS. Now the only change we need to make, the paths that are being watched right now is our CSS folder. Now remember, we changed it to SCSS. So we can add a new file, let's say custom. We can add a file, variables, and then in our app SCSS, which would be our manifest file, we can do our imports, such as at import variables. So we get our variables first, and then at import custom. This way we have our variables, which we didn't define any yet, and we have our custom CSS, SCSS, which we could define here. This will all go into our main application manifest SCSS, which Brunch will configure into regular CSS when we're loaded in the browser. Next, let's choose a different framework to use. Let's use Bulma. Bulma is a modern CSS framework. I've used it several times recently and it's pretty good. Npm install Bulma to get started. You could also use the CDN. We're going to use the CDN from Font Awesome. We're going to paste that in the head section of our app HTML. But for the actual Bulma min CSS, we're going to npm install save Bulma. Now once that installs, we can go to our configuration file and use that include paths to include node modules Bulma. In our app SCSS, we can import Bulma. As you can see, there have been some changes made in the font. You can see that it looks different. That lets us know that everything is working correctly. Let's try to grab a navigation from Bulma so that we can see what it's going to look like. Okay, here's the navigation that we're going to copy. For now, we'll create a file in our layout folder called _nav.html.ex, and that's where we're going to put the code for our navbar. And then we'll go to our app HTML, and where our navbar comment is, we can put some Elixir code in between bracket parentheses equal. We'll make a call to render nav.html, and we'll pass the connection through. And as you can see, we now have our navbar across the top with the icons and the Bulma logo, which obviously we could change. And let's go ahead and delete everything that's in this file so that we just have our navbar for right now. So now we have a navbar, we have Bulma as our CSS framework, and we're ready to continue building our application. One thing we'll need to consider is that Bulma is a CSS framework. It does not come with any JavaScript. So what this means is we'll have to add JavaScript to our framework in order to get the hamburger icon to work when it's clicked on. So as you can see right now, we have our navbar across the top. If we shrink the width of the page to simulate an iPad or phone or something like that, or a smaller screen, we get the hamburger icon, but when we click on it, nothing is happening. So in order to get this to work, what we're going to need to do is add some JavaScript. Now we can easily do that with Phoenix by going into our application. Under assets, we have a JavaScript folder, and here we have an app file, which is like the manifest file. So we can add another file called something like base.js, and then this is where we could put some basic JavaScript that is going to be required by our application. So if we save this file, we can import it into our manifest file with an import statement. We'll say import base from base. So we're going to import this file, which is in this current directory. If we go back to our application, Phoenix should have already reloaded it for us. So if we click on the icon, you can see everything comes up here. Now we have our navigation at the top. So if our application depends on some JavaScript, it's really easy to add that JavaScript in, and then also to keep it modular and separate. Now that we have a good understanding of how to set up and start working with Phoenix applications, in the next video we'll actually build a Phoenix application. Thanks for watching. Thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe for more. In the next video, we're going to use some of Phoenix's real-time communication and interact with a blockchain. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys in the next video.